on the one hand, from post-colonial difference perspectives of the kind we encounter, say, Arthur Chatterjee's work or the subaltern studies more generally, post-colonial perspectives which assert that the experience of Asia and Africa is incommensurable, if you like, with the experience of Europe, that it has to be understood purely in its own terms and that it's irreducibly distinct. So I've been trying to develop a space that's distinct from this post-colonial perspective, as well as, and at the same time, that's distinct from a sort of seamless liberal universal perspective that takes, if you like, the experience of Western Europe as its starting point. So the larger project is how do we find a space that's distinct from both a seamless liberal universalism, in which the experience of Asia and Africa is always judged in terms of what's occurred in Europe, and a post-colonial difference perspective that claims that Asian and African experiences is utterly incomparable and distinct from what we find in Europe. One route that I try to follow in my book is to map what Tamil Mufti has termed vernacular modernities, basically giving substance to ideas like secularism or social justice or democracy in non-Western contexts. That, I think, is a promising avenue for developing a space that's distinct from both of these. And it's the one that I follow in my own work. A second related aspect of this larger project that I'm trying to develop is to rethink the relationship between theory and practice, between theoretical work and empirical work, and to widen the remit of political thought, of the study of political thought, beyond key thinkers and texts where it has been fastened for a long time. So the project, as Kriti just mentioned, is to examine more mundane forms of political thinking, whether we encounter these in constitutional or legislative debates, as in the case of materials I shall speak to today. But more broadly, everyday political thinking can be encountered in many other contexts, in public reasoning in courts of law, in reasoning we encounter in other institutional domains, as well as social practices. Everyday narratives would also form part of this, or would form part of political thinking in this broader sense that I'm trying to explore in my work. These also merit study, not just as supplementary texts that we can add to those produced by great thinkers and by political leaders, but these really form an essential source for discerning, if our interest is in discerning the creation and the transformation of political norms, if our project is to understand how that happens, then these are really essential sites to discern how political norms are created and transformed over time. These processes are necessarily connective, not individual, and require us to look at the give and take of reasons between actors in various domains. Okay, on to the subject of my talk today, India's constitutional settlement on group rights. And I use the term broadly to refer to a range of provisions that are conventionally looked at under minority rights, as well as affirmative action, reservations in the Indian context. India's constitutional settlement on group rights is an important and neglected subject of study. I had originally started work on this as a master's student at Oxford, where there were about three items I could cite in my literature review. There was Retzlaff's old study in 1963, which really is the basis for Austen's later work. Randall Austen's Magisterial study draws a lot upon Ralph Retzlaff's earlier study. Then there was, of course, Austen's work, Randall Austen's work, India's Constitution, Cornerstone of the Nation. and the work of S.K. Chaudhary. These were three items that I would mention in the mid-1990s. The debates themselves had remained neglected, strangely, by scholars of Indian politics. Since the 1990s, there's been a renewed spate of interest in these debates, partly because in 1997, people woke up to the fact that India had been around for 50 years, the constitution had been around for nearly 50 years, making it one of the longest standing constitutions in the post-colonial world. So there was interest on account of its relative longevity in comparative terms, but also because of the rise of Hindu nationalism in India and the ways in which it was bringing central ideas of the constitution, like secularism, into focus. What I want to try and do today is to revisit the central argument, whose initial formulations go back a long time now, but to rethink this in the light of newer work that I've been doing as part of a project on comparative affirmative action with Dr. Graham Brown, based at the University of Bath, which an initial project. We're just completing a piece that compares Indian and Asian debates on affirmative action. But as part of that, we are also developing an approach to hegemony, which I want to try and apply to my own Indians today. I'll try and defend three claims, and I won't be able to defend them fully. I won't have the time, but I'll try and do what I can, and please come back with more questions. The first claim is that constitution making in India, which occurs between the mid-1940s, 1946 to the end of 1949, that this marks a major break with respect to group rights. Those of you who are familiar with the historical debates on the subject would know that historians have often emphasized continuities between the Indian constitution and what went on before. The work of David Washbrook, of Aisha Jalal, etc., has tended to, as it were, emphasize the continuities between post-colonial, the structures of authority in post-colonial India and what occurred before. The first claim I'm making is at least as far as group rights are concerned, the Indian constitution marked a break. There's more break than continuity. There's also, of course, elements of flexibility. The constitution itself has been hailed, as some of you would know, as a prescient model of multicultural accommodation at a time when many liberal states didn't accommodate group differentiated rights. The Indian constitution did, and this is seen by many to be an example of how practice in Asian Africa has been ahead of practice in Europe and elsewhere. And it's certainly true that in many of the Indian constitution does incorporate many multicultural provisions and was ahead of its peers in many respects. However, if we look at late colonial India, in relation to late colonial India, the regime of group rights, as it enters the Constituent Assembly and then subsequently the Indian Republic, is curtailed at constitution making. It's curtailed at the moment of transition. So yes, it does accommodate group rights, but these were less than the order of group rights that had existed in the late colonial period. Somewhat anachronistically, we can describe it as a limited multicultural position, and I'll try and say a bit more about what I mean by that and how it plays out in different areas. My second claim is that existing approaches to why group rights come to be constrained during constitution making. Existing approaches have, of course, been dominated by the long event of partition. There's a range of works that I'll come to in more detail, but basically, because of partition, it is thought that group rights were, that it's obvious that group rights would be curtailed. Partition was seen to have occurred as a result of strong consociational provisions that had existed in the late colonial state, like separate electorates. So separate electorates were seen to be responsible for Indian partition in the Indian nationalist account of group rights, and these came to be abolished, separate electorates came to be abolished, but also reserved seats, legislative quotas for religious minorities, which were actually included in the first draft of the Constitution in 1948. These were withdrawn by 1949. The first sort of claim I want to make, or the second claim I want to make now in relation to the curtailment of group rights is that the structure of nationalist ideology is important for understanding why these assumed the forms they did eventually under the Indian Constitution. Ideas in general have been neglected in the scholarship on Asia and Africa, but in recent times there has been something of a revival of interest in ideas, at least in the Indian context. The writings of Sunil, of Ram Guha, of Professor Devji, of Chris Bailey in recent times have sought to revive the study of ideas in India and South Asia more broadly. However, this attentiveness to ideas has largely taken the form of recuperation of the thought of great figures. So Nehru and Gandhi, Ambedkar, of course, Jinnah. And this has been the case also in the case of sort of social scientists who are usually more attentive to collective social practices. So if we take the accounts of Indian national ideology that we encounter in the work of Partha Chatterjee or indeed Ashutosh Varshney, these are based entirely on reviews of the leaders of the Indian national movement. Varshney's account of composite nationalism was based entirely on Nehru's discovery of India. But as I should try and show today, the shape of group rights in the Indian Constitution was not determined by Nehru's view of these. Nehru didn't like reservations. He didn't want reservations for Dalits and Adivasis, which were instituted by the Indian Constitution and have, of course, expanded since. He didn't want these, so his preference was not to retain reservations. And he would have certainly liked, in a range of other areas, that I should discuss, possibly a different set of formulations. If we look at ideas in the context of, if we sort of unfasten them from persons where ideas have tended to be examined, and from their beliefs and motivations, and look at these in the context of collective rhetorical practices like debates, we can make more sense of why group rights came to assume the form they did in the Indian Constitution. So my claim is not just that nationalist ideas help us to understand the final shape, but that the process of debate and ideas in this process of debate, rather than in the thought of Nehru or Ambedkar, help us understand the final shape of these group rights better. I've written elsewhere of how we can extract a set of concepts from a range of debates on group rights in the Constituent Assembly, the concepts of secularism, of social justice, of democracy, of national unity and development. These 5 concepts form an interlocking, if you like, vocabulary, which was shared by nationalists of different ideological hues, Hindu traditionalists as well as secular modernists. There were a lot of internal variations within nationalist opinion in the Constituent Assembly debates. But for all these variations, the nationalist opinion of this period converged on seeing political safeguards, which were a special type of group rights, reservations essentially, in seeing reservations as inconsistent with the central tenets of this vocabulary, with secularism, with justice, with democracy, with national unity, and with development. They were all construed as all strong multicultural rights, of which examples would be separate electorates, for instance. These were just seen as totally incompatible with these sorts, with the ideals on which the Indian nation was sought to be fashioned. They were construed as compatible with some limited group rights, and that is indeed the form in which we find group rights retained in the Indian Constitution. In other words, the forms of group rights eventually assumed after this long 3-year period of deliberation in the Constituent Assembly, which was occurring in the midst of partition and a lot of upheaval. There were many changes to the actual wording of these provisions. So the forms that is eventually assumed were highly consistent with the structure of this vocabulary, much more so than with the preferences of Nehru or Ambedkar. Ambedkar, of course, wanted was initially pressing for separate electorates for the ex-untouchables, but that it's including in the Constituent Assembly. So he didn't really get what his first preference was. Nehru didn't get what his first preference was either. What eventually occurred was the result of a process of compromise, and a compromise in which both the institutional forms and the normative framework of group rights shifted from consociationism to affirmative action. That was the shift, and it was a shift both in the institutional forms as well as in the normative framework of group rights. Okay, this brings me to my third claim, which is that constitution making marked a shift also in the parameters of political debate, not just in the forms of group rights and forms in reservations covered and didn't cover, but also in the parameters of political debate. And this nationalist vocabulary came to be translated during the course of the Assembly's deliberations into a shared vocabulary of political debate, so that secularism, democracy, social justice, national unity and development would be invoked in claims made on behalf of various groups for minority rights, as much as by nationalist opinion opposed to group rights. I should say that I use the terms nationalist opinion and minority claims as heuristic, if you like, categories. So the people who inhabited these changed both over time and across issues. The same person could occupy a nationalist position on one issue and a minority, as it were, rights and opposition committed to strong multicultural rights on another position. So it's important to make that point before I go any further. Individuals move from one category to another across issues and over time. So what does this suggest? The fact that the parameters of debate were transformed. Of course, at one level, it simply suggests that the Congress Party was not simply dominant, but it was also hegemonic. It was able to transform this nationalist vocabulary into a shared framework for debate. At another level, the fact that the constitutional settlement was hegemonic meant that it demanded concessions from the Congress and put constraints on the Congress itself that wouldn't have been necessary if the Congress had simply pursued dominance, if it had simply pursued the strategy of it was dominant anyway. I'm not going into the numbers, but there's a very comprehensive account of this that you can find in Austin. There's some 82% of the the Congress Party. So it's overwhelmingly dominant. But it chose, if you like, hegemony, and that meant that it had to make certain concessions as well. This is, if you like, the story I want to tell today. The hegemony is, of course, a term which has received extensive and erudite treatment in the literature of Indian politics, and I won't go into it in much detail today. The works of Partha Chatterjee, Ranjit Guha, and others. I don't want to talk very much about the conception of hegemony that underpins my argument today, except to say it's different from these post-Marxist accounts that we encounter in the works of Chatterjee and others, in that it's not linked to a social category, so there's no sort of bourgeoisie or social class that I'm sort of linking it to in my account here. I also want to press an aspect of hegemony which is neglected in their work, which is that hegemony also constrains the powerful. It doesn't simply, as it were, it's not simply an act of domination of the powerless, it's also a constraint on the powerful as well. I only want to talk about ideational hegemony, which is a condition when a set of ideas is accepted across a range of political actors with conflicting interests. I'm not going to talk about its institutional or coercive dimensions of hegemony today. Ideational hegemony, if we simply define it as I've tried to do, as a set of ideas accepted across a range of actors with conflicting interests, with conflicting political interests. This is necessarily a systemic phenomenon. Individual actors can have hegemony pursuing strategies, but they don't translate into a state of hegemony, a condition of hegemony, unless these are accepted by other parties. So the attainment of hegemony is a process of assertion and testing of ideas, which also makes constitutional legislative debates a very good site for testing hegemony. I'll try and flesh these claims out in a little more detail, but I wanted to check how much time I had left. Kriti, how much time?
Oh, you have plenty of time. You have more than half an hour, so do go on.
Great. So back to my first claim, that constitution making marked a major shift, a departure in the long history of group rights, their long career in India, which dates back to the late 19th century. I'm sure some of you would be familiar with the works of Mark Gallagher and others, which have shown how from the late 19th century onwards, there are forms of preferential treatment for groups designated as backward in India's princely states, as well as later in British India. So both in British India and in princely India, from the late 19th century onwards, coeval with the introduction of representative institutions in India, we find a growing, if you like, expansion of group rights. So when representative institutions were introduced, the first question, of course, was on what basis were Indians to be represented, and the answer, Sylvan's work and the work of other scholars has shown us, was the group. It was the group that formed, if you like, the unit of representation in colonial legislatures. That was one form of group rights, the preferential treatment in states like Mysore and Kolhapur, which, according in government employment, was for the backward, so-called backward sections of the population. That was another form of group rights. So it's a pretty long history in India of group differentiated rights, and these were instituted for a range of groups designated as minorities or as backward. The late colonial state, scholars have described it as a consociation state. Steve Wilkinson's work, for instance, and that is the case. So there was an attempt at minority proportionality in legislatures, in cabinets, in government employment, minority veto. These are classic features of the consociation system of group rights, and these were to be found in late colonial India, in British India, and there was also a system of reservations for tribals that started as well in colonial India. So there's a whole range of group differentiated rights that we find in the colonial period. Against this, and the early 20th century can be seen as, and I've tried to show how in more detail in my book, it can be seen as a time when these rights were progressively augmented in a range of areas. When viewed against this, constitution making marked a moment of containment of group rights. This containment assumed different forms in different areas of group rights. Broadly speaking, group rights were of two types. There were those that were then known in the mid-1940s as political safeguards, which are now known in Indian debates as reservations, more broadly as quotas. These comprised a representation in legislatures, in executives, and in government employment. And then there were so-called cultural safeguards. These covered areas of religious, cultural, and educational rights. The most far-reaching changes during constitution making occurred to political safeguards for religious minorities, which were basically abolished. As I just mentioned, from the first to final draft of the Constitution, reservations in legislatures and government employment for religious minorities were abolished. Separate electorates had been unacceptable from the start, but via media had been sought in the form of reservations. These were also withdrawn. But attenuation can also be discerned in other areas of group rights. There are three broad positions that can be distinguished for analytical purposes that the different constitution makers can be plugged within for one issue or one period. One position can be described as assimilationist stroke integrationist, and this basically wanted no group differentiated rights at all. So all such rights as incompatible with that vocabulary that I tried to outline at the start. Assimilationists were distinct from the integrationists. Assimilationists were often cultural nationalists, integrationists were often Nehru and many, in some moods, was an integrationist. So, yeah, the two positions were slightly distinct, but in many, these were, it was a position which was defined by its opposition to group differentiated rights. At the opposite end of the spectrum, there was the multinational multinational, if you like, category, which was composed of people pressing for maximum, if you like, group rights. Separate electorates would be an example. Quotas in cabinets, in the executive, that would also be elected through separate electorates, and these were various proposals that were put forward. That would be another example. There were several minority representatives initially occupied the multinational position. A third position can be described as limited multicultural. This was accommodating of some types of group rights, though not all. So reservations, okay, but for a limited period, and only really for so-called backward sections, maybe for religious minorities for a short period. That was what sort of defined this limited this limited multicultural position. There were some cultural and religious freedoms that, that is included, but strong multicultural rights were not included in this. Now, individuals moved across these different positions over time, as well as across issue areas. So somebody like K. Munshi, who would be an assimilationists on the question of, say, personal laws or of Dalit rights, was close to certainly close to a multinational, certainly a strong multicultural position for language rights. So when it came to the issue of language rights, he wanted them to assume a much stronger form than they finally had in the Indian constitution. So people were not locked into these positions. They moved, and indeed my argument is that a lot of representatives initially pressing for multinational positions moved to the limited multicultural position over time, and so did many sort of assimilations and integrations. So that's how we feel like the constitutional compromise was worked out over time. This process of working out the compromise was a long and often contentious process in which the actual wording of provisions was hammered over in subcommittees, and then there were several subcommittees. Subcommittee of Minority Rights was one, Subcommittee of Fundamental Rights was another, there was a subcommittee for tribal areas, so there were several different subcommittees for group rights itself, which were all under the umbrella of an advisory committee, the advisory committee itself then reported back to the Constituent Assembly. There are two broad stages that scholars have distinguished in the drafting of the Constitution. There's the first report stage, which is 1946-47, and then there is the draft stage. And at each stage, there's contest over the wordings of these provisions in each of these sites, and they get a form for a certain time. So the draft Constitution was published in February 1948, and then many of the provisions of the draft Constitution came to be amended in 1948-49. So there are several incarnations and a detail of the wording of these provisions, and I detailed some of these in my book. They changed a lot over time, but basically, broadly, they can be described as shifting in the case of political safeguards for religious minorities. The shift was from a limited multicultural position to an integrationist or an assimilationist position. So these were abolished, basically. In the case of cultural rights and religious rights of minorities, and in the case of reservations for Dalits and Adivasis, that shift didn't happen. So the limited multicultural position held. It held for the Dalits, Adivasis, and cultural and religious rights. It didn't hold for political safeguards for religious minorities. Is that clear? Would you like me to go over something? Okay, now accounts of the attenuation of special rights have largely focused on religious minorities, Ansari, Wilkinson, etc. But the containment of consociationism occurs across the board. It occurs in the case of provisions for the scheduled castes and tribes as well. So, for instance, guaranteed representation in the executive was rejected in the case of scheduled castes. Even the relatively weak instrument of instructions to the president regarding the desirability of representation of minorities in the cabinet, this came to be removed, and this had been a key concern of the scheduled caste representatives during the early stages of constitution making. There were many twists and turns in this process. A key dynamic was the separation of group rights for Dalits and Adivasis on the one hand, group rights for religious minorities on the other. That was absolutely key. It's emphasized in various ways through various amendments during the drafting of the Constitution. So the first Minority Report of 1947 states that the state should be run so that minorities should not feel oppressed by the fact that they are minorities. Noted that it was a fundamental duty of the state to take special steps to bring up those minorities which are backward in the level of the general community. This uncoupling of special provisions for so-called backward classes from that of minorities was underscored in other ways through specifying, for instance, that Dalits were not a minority. There was a specific amendment that K. Munshi put forward, which was accepted, that Dalits should be defined as backward classes and not minorities. And it aided the shift in state solicitude from minorities, where it had resided in the later Roman period, to the backward classes, and the progressive narrowing of reservations to the so-called backward classes, which is of course an official term in the Indian Constitution. It's the Indian Constitution propagated that term. Now, this shift from consociationism to affirmative action is illustrated very well by the changing fortunes of the term minority itself during the Constituent Assembly's deliberations. At the start of the Assembly's deliberations, representatives who are speaking in support of special provisions for any group describe the group concerned as a minority and try to establish why it should be regarded as a minority. So, for instance, there are many Dalit representatives claiming special or claiming reservations for Dalits who said, S. Nagappa is a quote from S. Nagappa, who said, so I don't claim we are a religious minority or a racial minority, I claim we are a political minority. We are a minority because we were not recognized all these days, and we were not given our due share in the administration of the country. So there's an attempt at the start of the Assembly's deliberations by any representative seeking to make a case for special provisions or special reservations or quotas for you to describe or to establish that a group concerned was a minority of some kind. In official categorization, as I just mentioned, an amendment was adopted defining the term minority more narrowly to exclude the scheduled castes or Dalits from its ambit. K. Munshi stated in support of his amendment, so far as the scheduled castes are concerned, they are not minorities in the strict meaning of the term. Harijans are part and parcel of the Hindu community, and safeguards are given to them to protect their rights only till they are completely absorbed in the Hindu community. And that's an example of assimilations, if you like, position, which won on that particular provision. By the end of the debates, however, the term backward was begun, and in line with this amendment and a range of other processes, the term backward had become the preferred designation to denote a group's entitlement to special treatment, and was increasingly employed by representatives, including of some religious minorities. So there was now an attempt by the end of the Constituent Assembly's deliberations by representatives of religious minorities to establish that religious minorities were also backward. So it shifts from, that's the shift from, if you like, associations and to affirmative action that I'm trying to describe. So you have Muhammad Ismail Sahib saying in November 1948 that they are backward people among the non-majority people as well. The Christians are backward, so also the Muslims, like the scheduled castes. This sort of decline in the fortunes of the term minority during the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly captures this transformation in the framework of group rights in its transition from colonial to independent India. Okay, moving on to claim 2, explanations. Explanations for this shift, how and why. I'm sorry, there's a lot of text there. Don't worry if you can't read it all. It was for me to make sense of the material I needed to get across. I don't suppose it's clearly visible there, but I will be going over a lot of it. So don't worry. When I first began to work on these debates about 15 years ago, I was really surprised that this shift wasn't written about very much. There wasn't much discussion of the abolition of reservations for religious minorities and the broader reorientation in the framework of group rights. It was there in Retzlaff's work, it's mentioned in Austin and Chauvet. It's not really regarded as a problem that needed investigation, that needed explaining. Partly, this seemed to be a function of the dominance of partition in accounts of this period. And because partition was considered, if you like, to obviate the need for reservations for religious minorities, etc., it was seen as, not seen as an issue which needed explaining. Partition was seen as a sufficient explanation for the attenuation of rights of religious minorities during constitution. Religious minorities. Well, Pakistan has been conceded, and that weakened the strategic position of minorities, it weakened the organizational position of minorities, with a lot of members of the Muslim League migrating to Pakistan, and of course the numerical position of minorities as well weakened after partition because their numbers became fewer in independent India as a proportion. In the early writings on the subject, there's very little discussion of the removal of religious minorities and the general reorientation in the framework of group rights. Retzlaff is really the only piece that focuses fully on this. Austin and Chauvet really accounts of the assembly's function more broadly. More recently, since 2000, there's been growing interest in this area, and there have been newer works that have emerged. And if partition dominates these works as well, but if we try and unpack this black box of partition, it yields a range of different factors that are cited as influential for this reorientation in group rights. So, of course, strategically, as I've mentioned, the position of religious minorities is weakened after partition is considered minorities lose their best bargaining card and their most powerful advocate. The Muslim League breaks up. The Sikh Public Party also breaks up in this period, and this means that there's really no cohesive position that many Muslim and Sikh representatives can offer against the changes that are occurring to constitution positions. The strategic and the organizational impact of partition on the minority position is seen basically to weaken it to a point where there were really no spokesmen and no real bargaining points that could be offered for the retention of reservations for religious minorities. Numerically as well, proportions of minorities declined, and for instance, Catherine Hayes' work mentions that the diminished proportion of Muslims within the state decreased their bargaining power. In addition to these effects of partition, partition is also thought to have changed attitudes against minority safeguards. both within the Congress party, so the hardening against strong group rights within the Congress party. Retzlaff talks about this because reservations were seen to perpetuate communalism, which is seen to have resulted in partition, etc. That and Wilkinson observes that the antipathy towards Muslims over partition, these combined led to a rapid dismantling of minority safeguards. But partition is also thought to change minority attitudes as a result of their weakened bargaining position. So it's thought that it's with their weakened bargaining position, religious minorities, particularly Muslims, thought that their interests could be best achieved by not antagonizing the Congress and Hindu opinion, and they didn't want to be seen to be opposing a measure that was supported by both Nehru and Patel. That's the abolition of reservations for religious minorities. Now, I've argued in several places that partition may have been a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient explanation, as is commonly assumed, for several reasons. First, certainly partition weakens the bargaining position of minorities, but it also puts the Congress on test, as it were. It's now, the Congress party is now called to make good its long-standing claim that it's a representative of all Indians and not just Hindus. The Congress had always insisted that it represented all sections of Indian opinion. It wasn't just the Hindu party as colonial negotiators had sought to portray it. So it could hardly be seen to be forcing a Hindu majoritarian agenda or even a narrow party agenda on a question that had for so long and so bitterly divided Indians. It's worth recalling that reservations for religious minorities were actually incorporated into the draft constitution after the decision to partition the country had been announced. And they remained in the draft constitution for a long period afterwards, until Patel could, and until the drafters could get minority representatives to themselves renounce these provisions. So the Congress was seen, it was keen to be seen, not to be steamrolling, if you like, its agenda. And many scholars say that if the initial timetable for the constitution had been adhered to, there would have been reservations for religious minorities if the constitution had been completed in 1948 as originally envisaged. Partition also doesn't explain if the cases that Congress had no need to conciliate minority opinion after partition. Why were the limited multicultural rights retained in the realm of religious, cultural, and educational rights at all? What was the need to retain these if there was no need, as it were, to make any so-called concessions to minorities? Why does the Indian Constitution incorporate a pretty expansive definition of religious freedom, which includes the right to propagate religion against what many Hindus, Constituent Assembly, many Hindu sympathizers want to. It includes provisions for state aid for minority education institutions to preserve minority cultures and minority languages. It includes legal pluralism in the form of religious personal laws, Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Parsi, and Jewish laws were retained despite strong opposition from both the left and the right within the party. So, partition-based explanations which claim that Congress basically capitulated to its Hindu majoritarian strand, in Hindu, this really don't capture the full picture of constitutional outcomes on group rights. there's in any case little evidence that the civic nationalists converted to ethnic forms of nationalism after partition, as some have alleged. Indian nationalism remains ideologically diverse after partition. Although there is attenuation, it's also not the case that the assimilationists and integrationists got their way. There were many who said, well, what is the need for having, there were many from within the Congress who said, well, what's the need for having such a wide definition of religious freedom for minorities? Why should right to propagate religion be included, and why should we not withdraw cultural and educational rights from religious minorities and just leave them for linguistic minorities? But the limited multicultural position held in the case of those provisions. So the attempts by Pandit G.P. Pant and Damodar's Singh and others to limit religious, cultural, and educational rights of minorities did not succeed in altering their shape in the Indian constitution. And in fact, in these areas, it's minority concerns that prevailed to a large extent in the final text of the constitution. And in many small areas, I will go into those in great detail. So if we look at the career of religious, cultural, and educational rights for minorities in the Constituent Assembly, the limited multicultural position does hold, and the conflation of it towards the assimilationist position, which is what we find in Wilkinson and others, is problematic. Okay, so what then explains this diversity of institutional outcomes with respect to religious minorities? That in some cases there is retraction, as in the case of reservations. In other cases there's a retention in limited multicultural form. The short answer, and I have elaborated in great detail in the book, is that it's Indian nationalist ideology, and the component concepts of this ideology that I mentioned were long-standing. Partition added ballast, but it was not the source, it was the trigger. Perhaps these changes would not have happened without partition, but it was not the cause, it was not the source, as it were. For the Congress to dismantle such long-standing safeguards while plausibly claiming to carry all sections with it on this most divisive of political questions, the availability of such a normative resource was pretty crucial. Okay, now this nationalist vocabulary that I mentioned was comprising notions of secularism, democracy, justice, development, and national unity. Each of these were complex concepts, and there was debate on their meaning within the Congress, in the Constituent Assembly. But apart from the Congress, there are several other political movements and parties which contributed to the development of these ideas historically. What Congress did in the mid-20th century was to stitch these together, if you like, using the thread of national unity. So that's essentially what the nationalist vocabulary was. It gave primacy to national unity, but it incorporated a range of concepts that several modern movements, political parties had espoused in India, in late colonial India. The requirements in this period, the requirements of national unity, and then by extension of secularism, democracy, and justice, were seen as incompatible with strong multicultural rights. There were, of course, many strands within nationalist opinion, and as I've mentioned already, each of these concepts needs more unpacking than I'm able to do now, where secularism emphasized religious freedom or equal citizenship. There were big debates over this. National unity is another omnibus term that I unpack into different components in my book. But the basic idea is that for all these differences, nationalists of different ideological hues, Hindu nationalists as much as fervent secularists, converged on the view that reservations detracted from national unity and from secularism, from the meanings of these concepts that were dominant in this period. And when, for instance, reserved seats for religious minorities were withdrawn in 1949, Nehru commended their abolition as a historic turn in our destiny, confessing that he had never been convinced about the provision. Reluctantly, we agreed to carry on with some measure of reservation, but always there was this doubt in our minds, namely whether we had not shown weakness in dealing with a thing that was wrong. It was seen as wrong, reservation was seen as it were wrong in terms of secularism. And doing away with this reservation business is not just a good thing in itself, it shows that we are really sincere about having a secular democracy. So you see how the different concepts, in a sense, supported each other, and their meanings were closely tied to national unity and how its requirements were construed in this particular period. And the threat that reservations were seen to pose to national unity was reinforced by liberal understandings of the requirements of secularism, democracy, and justice, by standard liberal understandings, I should say, which require the same rights as it would for all, irrespective of religion, caste, or tribe. The further question that my argument raises is, how did reservations then survive in the case of Dalits and Adivasi, the so-called backward classes? The short answer is that there were resources within the nationalist vocabulary. These resources were fashioned for the justification of such rights. This is my argument, my reading. You can sort of contest this, of course, that there were arguments in terms of justice and national unity and development, because reducing socio-economic disparities between groups was seen as something that would bring Dalits and Adivasis into the national mainstream and would also would also accelerate national development and progress. So there were arguments for affirmative action provisions within the nationalist vocabulary. There weren't arguments for strong multicultural rights, and even provisions for reservations for affirmative action were admitted as temporary mechanisms. Eventually, the hope was that they would not be necessary. They were seen as a means of reducing social disparities, not of protecting group difference in any way. That legislative and employment quotas for religious minorities were withdrawn is something which can be understood in relation to the contours of this vocabulary. The institution in terms of group rights were consistent with its normative structure. Now, even if you accept my argument so far, you may say, why can't we simply ascertain all of this by reading Nehru? Why do we need to trawl through these debates or by looking at the writings of key leaders? That's what most historians and social scientists have done. What's debate adding here? What's it adding to the picture? Two dimensions, and I'll conclude with those, and perhaps we can discuss these at greater length. I think focus on debate as to new dimensions explanation, and I really won't be able to substantiate it because it requires me to give you long quotations from these debates, and I'm sure you're tired of hearing this now. There are two dimensions that it adds to ideation explanation. One, the constitutional outcomes on group rights were more consistent with the patterns of ideological convergence and divergence than with the preferences of powerful figures such as Nehru and Ambedkar, as I've just mentioned. So Nehru, as I mentioned earlier, didn't want reservations. Ambedkar wanted separate electorates. If the outcomes were simply a compromise, a bargain between these two, that could explain reservations for Dalits and Adivasis, but it doesn't explain the rights to religious freedom, culture, and education, rights for minorities, which were retained in the limited multicultural form. So that's one suggestion. The second thing, the second addition the second difference that debates make in my account is that constitutional outcomes were not limited to changes in these provisions, as I've said. During the Constituent Assembly, this vocabulary of interlocking concepts came to be the new shared framework for political debate, whereas initially, at the start of the Constituent Assembly's deliberations, minority claims had relied on a colonial language of group entitlement. As the deliberations progressed, these increasingly invoked one or other concepts from the nationalist vocabulary, and in the process a shared legitimating vocabulary was forged, which was used by both advocates and opponents of group rights. And this is discernible in a range of debates across the Constituent Assembly. If we look at debates in political representation, those illustrate this most starkly, because the initial claims had been for strong multicultural rights like separate electorates. The claims of religious minorities for representation then moved to proportional representation, to forms of PR, which is defended as a mechanism, as an institutional mechanism that is more secular and more democratic than even reservations. And finally, the extension, the withdrawal of reservations for religious minorities is countered by both Muslim and Sikh representatives in the Constituent Assembly on grounds of secularism. For instance, there's, I'm looking for a quote, Sardar Hukam Singh speaking in May 1949 against the withdrawal of reservations for religious minorities in legislatures, queries, if scheduled castes get reservations for their backwardness, then is there any justification to deny this concession to similar backward sections suffering from identical disabilities simply because they profess the Sikh religion? Would this be secularism? And you see similar claims being made by Muslim representatives at that point. You're saying, because of secularism, we can't have separate electorates. But that's an indicator of how this vocabulary has, expanded to become a shared vocabulary, which is invoked also by opponents or advocates of reservations for religious minorities. Now, at one level, you could see this translation of the nationalist vocabulary to a shared framework of political debate as a form of nationalist hegemony. So the transition to colonial rule didn't simply take the form of Congress dominance, it took the form of hegemony, the construction of a new ideological consensus, and Congress was successfully able to translate its new electoral dominance into an ideological consensus. This doesn't mean that individuals within the Congress were able to get their preferences if you like, into the constitutional document. Nehru had to reconcile himself to reservations for Dalits and Adivasis, despite saying that he would like to put an end to such reservations that still remain. And Patel, Munshi and others with Hindu sympathies had to swallow the right to propagate religion as well. Yes, the vocabulary was translated into a shared framework for debate, but that doesn't mean that from that it doesn't follow that nationalist leaders were able to achieve their first preferences with regards to group rights in the Indian Constitution. They won, and that was the price for hegemony, if you like, that they had to pay. They didn't need to Congress party didn't need in numerical terms to compromise. It did because it wanted to build consensus or ideation hegemony. Now, one implication that follows from this, and I will really stop here, is that once, and this follows for the role of ideas and what happens to ideas once they become hegemonic. Once hegemony is achieved, ideas, as I'm trying to argue in another piece that I'm doing with Graham on Malaysian constitution debates, once hegemony is achieved, ideas become sticky in a sense that they acquire a degree of resilience, and that makes it more likely that ideation change occurs through attempts to work within existing ideas rather than to contest these head-on. So the fact that the Indian constitutional settlement was hegemonic meant that in India, in post-independence India, ideation, contestation and change has occurred mainly through challenges to the dominant meanings of these five concepts. And I try to show this in my book, in my account of my analysis of the Shah Banu and the Mandal debates, that the broad conceptual features of the legitimating vocabulary, the shared legitimating vocabulary forged during the Constituent Assembly's deliberations, these have endured and have become structural to the polity in sense. This has implications for many other debates. It has implications, for instance, the puzzle of the survival of democratic institutions in India in however flawed form. The existing explanations have emphasized the role of communal legacies of nationalist leaders like Nehru, but my account here suggests that we also need to take the survival of this vocabulary of public reasoning seriously as part of the reason for how and why democratic institutions survive. The second implication is, of course, even when hegemony obtains, hegemonic ideas can constrain the dominant as well. So this hegemony hasn't served to maintain Congress in power. Congress, its own political dominance has declined. That is also, if you like, an aspect of the hegemonic settlement that I'll come to in more detail in
Thank you, Rochana. Thank you for a very, very rich and thought-provoking paper. I am not a political scientist. I'm never going to pretend I am, for various reasons. But in a room full of political scientists, I think I should probably open the floor first to people who will speak from your discipline rather than from outside it, right? Because I work on something fairly close to what you're doing, and I'll sort of refrain from asking the opening questions. So, anyone burning to ask a question?
Mine's conceptual rather than a historical question with two parts. Firstly, in liberalism in India, I think you argue that we move more towards a set of positive liberties and kind of ignore negative liberties. But can you
questions. Yeah. Can I answer? Yeah, should I take one? That's fine. That's fine. I'm happy to take one at a time.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to try and avoid falling over myself.
Rochana, would you like to come and sit?
Yeah,
you probably deserve to sit now after an hour. Yeah.
I'm losing my voice a little, so I don't know if it will unnecessarily be audible from here, but let me know. Let me know if not. You're right, and that I've 2 points in relation to cultural rights. You're right that any right also includes a negative liberty not to be interfered with in the exercise of that right, so that's the case with the cultural rights. There's an interesting story behind in fact this particular issue of whether they should be understood purely in negative terms or also as implying a positive duty on the state to help minorities preserve their language and culture. The initial phrasing of the right was also to put a duty on the state to foster minority culture and minority cultures and minority languages. This was one right which it did come to be attenuated. So the state has in post-independence India, it has aided minority educational institutions, but it's not called upon to do so by the phrasing of the provision in the Constitution. The phrasing of the provision in the Constitution says that minorities are entitled to preserve their language and their culture and their script in the way they choose to, and the state is not prohibited from aiding them. It's not required to aid them as it is in the case of Dalits, as the state aid is required. It's written into the Constitution in the case of Dalits and Adivasis, as you know. But such a requirement is not written in, although it's also not prohibited. And Ambedkar, among others, said that there is no need to write it as a positive requirement. Of course, states are free to aid minority educational institutions, and so that's how that provision, debate over that provision was resolved. But in general, of course, rights would include both negative and positive, negative liberties as well as positive duties, but the extent of positive duty does vary. And the fact that the duty hasn't been written into the Constitution has also meant that it's seen as an illegitimate concession by the state when the Indian state has sought to aid minority educational institutions. It's seen to pamper minorities or appease minorities and various other. Hindu nationalists have criticized Congress-led administrations for on precisely these grounds. Yeah, so it's ongoing debate. My argument about negative liberties was a slightly different one that I make in the Liberalisms in India piece, is a slightly different one, and that is that haven't been strong arguments for why the liberties of individuals should be protected from intervention by society or states in general. This cultural right is a group right in the Indian Constitution. So my argument in that other piece, the Liberalisms in India piece, is an argument for the lack of articulation or elaboration of justifications for leaving individuals alone, for not interfering in their sphere of liberty of the kind you encounter in Mill or others, that you don't really find strong arguments as to why why states and societies should be limited and in what they can do to individuals. So that's in response to the first question. The second question was about, I'm sorry, my answer is really very long. Really sorry about that. What was the second question? Sorry?
Fear of reification versus our intuition that these are constitutive identities.
fear of reification. So yes, that was the fear of many constitution makers and reservations in general. In a comparative constitutional context, reservations are seen as freezing identities and also proportions. So, reservations, typically proportions of quotas are set at a particular time. Population percentages move over time, and reservations are seen as inflexible, both in terms of the proportions of the group and the identities of the groups concerned, which are ascribed and relatively inflexible. And in general, so that is something which comparative constitutionalists debate, and that's why reservations are less popular than other forms of, in comparative terms, less popular in as a mechanism of accommodation. Consociational provisions allow for self-ascription; those are preferred. There are various other sorts of provisions that theorists have argued for in preference to reservations. In the Indian context, they have, there is, as you know, with censuses, etc., become occasions for debate about community identity and which category a community then should be placed under. So it hasn't in India. The existence of reservations hasn't sort of stopped debates about the boundaries of community identity, but it has certainly created certain incentives in terms of the forms that these identities are inscribed into. Not the actual constitution, because the constitution doesn't contain a comprehensive list of beneficiaries of reservations, but the subsequent orders, the scheduled caste orders and elsewhere. So that is a general problem with reservations, but that hasn't stopped community identities from being more, if you like, or group identities from being more, if you like, from being contested and from being competitive and reformed in political coalitions, as the whole history of OBC mobilization, etc., suggests. So the overall impact on the polity hasn't been necessarily to reify community identity, but yes, within the terms of reservations, that is an issue. Yeah.
Rochana, there's a very long queue building up. So
okay, I'll try and be brief.
Request to all people asking questions and to the speakers, so that as we can take as many questions. I'm going to ask a very quick question at this point myself. And my question to you is about the notions of difference that the Constitution operates with. So I'm not talking about religion versus tribe versus caste. What is at what level is this difference perceived, so that certain kinds of differences become easily recognizable for safeguards, whether political or cultural, and other kinds are absolutely unamenable to them. For example, the women question being a very good example of a difference that cannot be mobilized through the conception of group rights, according to the way you've used the word. So what is the notion of difference that the Constitution and the debates and these people work with?
Okay. Good. Should I just address that very quickly? Yeah, no, that's an important question. By group rights, I was mainly referring to to ascriptive groups defined by religion, caste, language, tribe, and these, I suppose, are the four main axes of group rights within the constitutional framework. I haven't discussed at all the case of tribals, because it was discussed itself separately, and it also for reasons of time. But group rights were, the notion of difference itself shifts in this transition from consociationalism to formative action. So the initial perception of difference is cultural, is of a group that is culturally distinct in some ways from the majority or the mainstream, and that's seen to be an element which informs the notion of difference in initial debates. But this is of course sought to be difference is sought to be redefined as backwardness, as a difference which can in principle be transcended in a short period of time, and cultural, the relevance of cultural difference is diminished by in its ideal form by the constitution makers in the architecture of the constitution. That's what they would have liked to have done. Cultural differences sort of protected up to a point, but not as a basis for political rights, reservations, etc. And it's seen, so its significance is sought to be diminished in the polity, certainly. Yeah.
You didn't mention the directive principles of state policy at all.
No, absolutely.
This is to some extent regarded as a chapter in which you kick into the long grass issues which couldn't be put into legislation immediately. To what extent, or were there issues of group rights that were kicked into the long grass, as it were, to the directive principles because they couldn't be enacted immediately?
Yes, absolutely. The Uniform Civil Code is a great example. I didn't talk about that, but the Uniform Civil Code debates, I don't know if everyone is aware of the debates, but essentially the debate in the Constituent Assembly, it's a long-standing debate in Indian politics between those who think that religious separate laws for members of different religious groups in matters pertaining to personal matters, whether these in so-called personal matters pertaining to marriage, divorce, inheritance, maintenance, whether members should, whether individuals should be governed by their respective religious laws in these matters, or whether the state should enact a common, uniform civil code which encompasses all citizens and supersedes these Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Parsi and Jewish laws which currently which are currently recognized by the Indian legal system. The Indian legal system inherited this and continued this from the colonial state. The system of, there's a common criminal law in India, but there isn't a common civil law. And there were many proponents of a uniform civil code in the Constituent Assembly, both from the right and the left within the Congress. But they were accommodated through the incorporation of this provision as a directive principle, as an aspiration which the state would seek to, which was kicked into the long grass. Basically, they said, well, if the circumstances are right at some point, if the leadership of all communities agrees, we will do this, but not otherwise. So that's and that was, that's the provision which sort of, whereas religious personal laws are recognized by fundamental rights, so they have a stronger protection under the Indian Constitution, under rights to religious freedom, which pertain to individuals as well as groups. So that's one example, but there are others. But that's a great, the directive principles have, there's there are other interesting examples as well. But yes, we'll come to Nishant.
The first question was regarding this scheme that you tried to map out the place nationalists and the anti-nationalists at one end and the multinationalists at the other end, somewhere between the liberal multicultural, limited multicultural aspect. I don't understand why nationalists and the anti-granists should be placed together. Because, for example, if we even try to understand at the end of their thought process or the arguments that they were trying to develop, the end was primarily, maybe if you try to look at it on the discourse of nation, for example, some people like Mukherjee and others and then Nehru and others might have similarities, but if we see the arguments that they put forward about how this idea of assimilationism or integrationism would develop, there is a vast difference. And this difference actually comes into picture more prominently when we talk about the outcomes. Because if you see as a concept, the whole understanding of assimilationism or integration in that sense, in itself, integration would have space for accommodation and consensus, which assimilation might not have. So it's more possible that a person who believes in integration might give up to what consensus at certain levels, which assimilation argument might not do. So how does it suit the scale? A. B. On the idea of hegemony itself. To say that the kind of hegemony that we see there was different because it had the possibility of consensus. Don't you think hegemony in itself has that possibility of consensus? Otherwise, hegemony would have been dominance. Hegemony is hegemony because it has the. It is more about interaction and engagement of power relations at some level, and not necessarily a deterministic understanding of power, but there is some inherent scope for that kind of concessions or compromise at some level.
Yeah, no, they're both good questions. I agree that the assimilationist and integrationist positions are distinct on a lot of questions. I only place them together today for the limited purpose of this presentation because on the question of political safeguards for the minorities as well as in the case of so-called lower castes, they are both opposed to it, although for very different reasons, for completely different reasons, and they are opposed to it. But they converged, as it were, and it's very interesting where the two converge. We see outcomes as being quite different from where the two diverge. If we are to sort of plot convergence and divergence through the drafting of each provision in on group rights. So I place them together to indicate convergence. Convergence is not identity, and I agree that they did have spaces for accommodation, but assimilationists would say we have a space for accommodation as well within the, so long as you accept, Hindu hegemony, we will, or Hindu dominance, we will, if you like, accommodate minorities so long as, so I think they have different strategies of accommodation, assimilation and integration. They both have their own strategies of accommodation. But for different reasons, they converged in opposition to strong multicultural rights during the Constituent Assembly debates. And that's, but they didn't, so that's the first question. The second question, I agree with you that consensus is key to hegemony. I think, though, that we can't assume the existence of consensus. We have to demonstrate it empirically, and that's what I try. We can't assume that just because a political actor is dominant, it is also hegemonic. That's not the case. I mean, for instance, the Malaysian debates that I'm looking at the moment, UMNO was politically dominant, but it was not hegemonic. It had not made, as it were, an ideation and framework that everyone agreed to. And that is why you see much more ideological change in Malaysia. Oh, that's a different part of my work. But so I agree that consensus is essential to hegemony, but consensus can't be assumed from
the existence of dominance, simply from the existence of dominance. It has to be demonstrated empirically. And what I'm trying to do is to develop an empirical approach to hegemony, which goes beyond sort of post-Marxist approaches, which simply assume its existence if a force is sort of dominant in an arena. So, yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks, I have several questions. I'm going to restrict myself to one.
Sure.
In the interest of time, which is to kind of pick you up and ask you a bit more about the methodological agenda setting intervention you're making here in terms of trying to kind of create space for the approach to understanding ideas as causal factors in explaining political change, and to ask how you go about that, beyond the Constituent Assembly. So thinking about contemporary political debate, what are the kinds of spaces in which you study circulation of ideas? How do you start to delineate patterns of ideational and general consensus in kind of contemporary politics?
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I think in terms of sources, legislative debates are still a great place to look. For instance, the legislative debates of the late 1980s demonstrate very clearly the breakdown of Congress dominance, although the legacy of its ideational hegemony continues. The breakdown of its dominance can be seen very clearly in the lineaments of legislative debates. And for instance, in the Constituent Assembly debates, you had a hegemonic, by having a hegemonic formation, I meant there was sort of, one dominant meaning of secularism to which most, as it were, participants subscribe, or one dominant meaning of social justice. Although there's contestation, it's at the margins and it doesn't involve as many actors. The most of the if you like, conceptions sort of stack up along a single axis. Whereas when you come to the legislative debates of the late 1980s, there is no consensus on the meanings of secularism or social justice, and it's very, very clear that, in secularism, in the legislative debate on the Shah Banu case, the proponents of exemptions for Muslim personal law were saying secularism means religious freedom for minorities, that is Indian secularism, and so on, whereas their opponents were saying that secularism means equal citizenship and we should have the same laws for everyone, and we shouldn't have all these, we shouldn't have different laws applying to individuals simply on account of their religious membership. There were those remained unresolved till the end of the debate. And it really reflected the breakdown of Congress hegemony. Congress did not control the meaning of secularism any longer, which was then, of course, taken over by Hindu nationalists. With regard to, sorry?
Legislative focus. But outside the legislature, where else does one look to construct?
Well, for hegemony, legislative debates and constitutional debates are particularly a good source. But in general, in terms of the wider agenda that I was trying to outline at the start, of course, courts of law are a great case, and from the sort of high level to whether village panchayats. But even, I think that, we need more conceptual ethnographies of many institutional sites as well as non-institutional sites of categories of, narratives of, citizenship from, if you like, a variety of perspectives. Those would not necessarily give us information about hegemony in the same way, but they would yield information about ideas.
Just continuing from this, actually, whether the notion of the epistemic community, a group of people who actually think and deliberate this, both within some official spaces as well in the larger context. So my question would, so just flag that
again. I want to ask whether ideas then are limited first by the notion of, for example, realpolitik. So I'm thinking in terms of whether, considerations of sovereignty of India, or security, national unity you talked about, but sovereignty ever figured in the debates on these rights? And if yes and no, then can we really call it a settlement? Because in 1951 we saw Mukherjee leaving the cabinet because India signed a sort of pact with Pakistan on minority rights issues. So, and going back to the question of epistemic community, then it is always this moment of contingency where the epistemic community can build some sort of assertion, but it's always contingent. And whether you think this idea of epistemic community instead of sort of focusing on spaces or ethnographic approaches might be better.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a useful frame to use, and I don't know. I mean, I can't see how it would necessarily change my argument. And I think it's interesting. It's interesting, though, to think about it further. I haven't sort of thought about it, using the frame of epistemic community, but it's certainly something that it's a useful frame. I did want to, and certainly by hegemony, or by settlement, I don't mean that hegemony is never complete, and even the hegemony that Congress sort of achieved in this particular instance around a limited multicultural position it wasn't complete in terms of being fully shared by all participants to the same extent, and it wasn't equally robust in all areas. The Congress failed. It failed then, and it continues to fail to provide a proper normative grounding for the limited multicultural position in the case of religious minorities. It has fashioned it in the case of sort of Dalits and Adivasis, but not, in the case of religious minorities. So it's also internally not fully, as it were, developed or built up. So by settlement, and so there are points. There are points, several points of sort of incompleteness, weakness, etc., within any hegemonic formation or settlement.
Sovereignty a figure in these debates.
Yeah, and it did figure in these debates. I'm just trying to think in terms of its explicit invocation. It's often, in rhetorical terms, the term sovereignty is often invoked with integrity, and they'll say, well, sovereignty and integrity of India, that's sort of, so that's how it would sort of, and yes, the integrity of India was seen to be threatened in this period by, reservations or strong multicultural rights for religious minorities. So, yes, it figures in that way. But I think you're alluding to something broader, and it's worth thinking about more, and I'm happy to think about it more, but I have nothing further to say immediately. Sure.
On the top of committees, subcommittees, discussions, but
yeah, hi, sorry.
On the top of large committees discussing about these rights, but if you look at the original draft document, there are a lot of minority rights built into it. And all of this will go in precisely 2 days. On, I think, August 27th and 28th. On the discussion, in these 2 days, most of the rights will go. And these were the days when Govind and Patel, most right women among the Congress, talked a lot. And all the 4 members, or the 4 Muslim members, even the 4 Muslim members, 3 of them, they talked in favor of taking most of the rights. There was a lot of pressure on them to act on this way. One of these members actually asked for police support to come to the Constitutional Assembly. There was riots going outside. And so there was pressure on them to act in some way. They even asked for removal of reservations, apart from removal of separate electorates. And if you look at and this motion was moved by a Sikh member, legacy member. There are two motions moved by a Sikh member. But if you look at other limited multi-caste positions, there was a consensus among all kind of consensus among all the minority groups. If you look at schools or other education institutions. So, is there a pressure on governments, to act in?
Yeah, and that brings me to an aspect of the question, of an earlier question which I hadn't addressed, the realpolitik issue. Yes, there was certainly, and there's a lot of evidence that although in the meetings, the minority subcommittee chairman, who was of Christian background himself, moved the provision for the removal of reservations for religious minorities, and himself was a strong proponent of abolishing these. And H.C. Mukherjee, he says, once minorities have been given strong religious, cultural and educational rights, there's no need for reservations in legislatures and public employment for religious minorities. Patel and others then say, no, let each minority group debate this within their with their members, and then come back to discuss this. And in this period, there is pressure put on. I think Austin and others have remarked on the pressure that's put on minority representatives to change their minds, basically on reservations. In the case of Sikhs, the compromise is that. In the case of Sikhs, the compromise is that 4 Sikh castes are included within reservations in both legislatures and government employment by being incorporated in the scheduled caste list. In the case of Christians, the sort of realpolitik compromises with the right to propagate religion. So both they are members of both. In the case of Muslims, there were 2 members who abstained, including Maulana Azad, who was, is regarded as a key member in the drafting process. He remained unreconciled to the abolition of reservations for Muslims. He didn't speak, but he was sort of unhappy. And Begum Ejaz Rasool, who does speak, is seen to have been pushed to do so by Patel in contemporary accounts. So there was considerable pressure on minorities, and more generally, my account is not about saying that realpolitik didn't matter or that power doesn't matter, but more that power. I don't think that we should try and contrast power with ideas or norms. Power also worked through these ideas and norms, and these were part of, if you like, the repertoire of power, both as it was wielded by agents, but also the outcome in relation to hegemony. So an explanation such as mine is not incompatible with realpolitik or power-based accounts. It just says that you can't understand power itself properly without looking at ideas. Last question, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that talk. And I really like the shift from individual accounts to ideas. I guess on that very same point about how power works, I'm just wondering if the idea of Foucauldian discourse, which actually contains exactly that conceptual idea of how power works through discourse, and it's not disconnected from individuals. I mean, perhaps that's one way of thinking about that. But my real question linked to that is the notion of, or the use of the word multicultural. For me, obviously the resonance is very much coming from a genealogy of Western ideas of what multiculturalism means, and that genealogy is about the shift from race to culture. So it's a kind of racial genealogy. So the use of the term multicultural in this context a certain effect. I just wanted to open that up.
Yeah, no, that's both really good points. Very much, I mean, it's very much, it's very close to a Bourdieu type of approach to, to practices. This, what I'm trying to work towards over here, move away from the dominant paradigm in the history of political thought and ideas, which focuses on great individuals and texts, and which looks at ideas as rhetorical practices in a sense that are independent of even the beliefs of the agents who are articulating these, or its practices and behavior rather than beliefs that are, as it were, held by individuals or whatever motivations they may have held. Those are not really relevant. They don't change anything in what I've said in what I've said today. So yes, I agree with that reading, and I agree also that the term multicultural can be anachronistic, and I think I mentioned that briefly at the start, but perhaps not enough. Multiculturalism, can be seen, if you like, as liberalism's way of dealing with diversity, and as it attracts the same sort of criticisms that secularism does in Indian debates, that these are approaches that Europe developed in the course, or Europe or North America sort of developed in the course of its of their historical experience to deal with diversity. And India and other places in Asia and Africa have their own approaches of dealing with diversity, where people, very different people have lived alongside each other in peace for a very long time. Why do we need these? No, I think that was not your point. No, I'm taking it there. I agree that was not your point. And I'll come to your point, but I want to address that criticism as well, because it takes me to where I started from, my sort of critique of sort of post-colonial difference perspectives, because they would, both say that, well, why do we need these categories of secularism or multiculturalism in the Indian context? They're just sort of, totally inappropriate. And to some extent, there is some truth to that criticism, because the multi-level and multi-form diversity you encounter in India and many other places in Asia and Africa can't be captured fully within a category like multiculturalism. I nevertheless think that it's a useful category for comparative purposes, if we are looking at for comparative analysis. But I agree that there are it doesn't capture all of the, as it were, the Indian experience of diversity and ways of dealing with diversity. It's not fully adequate to the object. I still think it's useful analytically, and I think we can use categories like that for comparative purposes, even if they are anachronistic. The term Dalit is anachronistic to use necessarily for that period as well. So we are in the presence of anachronisms all the time. I think judgments need to be guided by usefulness for the task at hand, and for my task it was useful, although it doesn't capture everything.
You want to
Could I just make a point? Isn't it fair to say that the assault on Western Enlightenment values, which began in the 1970s, has no reflection in the debates on the liberal positions being taken by people taking part in the constitutional debates in the Constituent Assembly? So it is anachronistic as well.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, looking at the literature, you said that the literature on the Constitution was very thin when you started, and it was interesting that there's a 30-year gap between...
There's absolutely a 30-year
gap.
gap.
One that you quote in the 60s and one that you quote in the 90s.
Yeah.
And maybe, historians, that was the period in which Enlightenment values were most under assault. The whole post-colonial thesis was being argued out. The categories of Western liberalism were being attacked by people like Partha Chatterjee as well. I mean, do you find any reflection of that in the debates at the time?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. To some extent, there is that. I mean, there is debate in discussions of secularism, for instance. Although the term wasn't adopted formally, it was discussed, and its adoption was discussed during the Constituent Assembly debates itself. As I'm sure you know, it was only formally adopted in 1976, but there are many constitutional provisions which which make it a secular state, and there were provisions to incorporate it explicitly, and there were resonances of the debates we find later. There were early resonances of the debates, or early precursors, although to the debates we find later in the form of, we do have sort of Indian approaches, or that secularism in India can never be anti-religious, and secularism in India can, so it has to take sort of cognizance of faith, so that's sort of number one, and it has to take cognizance of groups rather than only individuals and their beliefs, so groups and their practices in the debates over the right to religious practice and so on. There was some cognizance that there's a difference in an Indian approach to a secular state from what you would find in Western contexts, but it didn't exist in a fully developed form as a sort of Indian versus Western. There wasn't much sort of anti-Westernism in the Constituent, Assembly or a challenge to. I mean, it was an Enlightenment arena of professionals who were seeking to if you like, proselytize Enlightenment values of all kinds that they thought their society didn't share enough of. So yes, I don't know if that answers the question.
At that point, we can thank you, Rochana, for a very thought-provoking paper and sharing your new work with us. Thank you.
That was a good question. I didn't answer it fully, but I didn't know what.
Because I've been reading myself a bit on, one thing that strikes me, I've just been reading on that, is how India signed the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So I've been reading a bit like on what kind of debates happen in foreign policy. So I haven't really looked at the real documents.
That's a great question, and I'd love to